Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for The Next Chapter with Charlie Hedges, as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, Paul. It's nice to be here with you again at OC Talk Radio, the studios. And I'd like to welcome all our listeners, new and long time, to The Next Chapter with Charlie. Today begins our second show with Father Robert Edwards of St. Margaret's Episcopal Church. We are having a discussion on the 4 weeks of Advent and talking about how Jesus impacted the world for the last 2,000 years. Since Advent celebrates the coming or arrival of the Christ in the bodily form of Jesus, the man, I think it's a perfect opportunity to examine how the birth of Jesus, as I said, has impacted all of humanity for the past 2,000 years. On the last show, we discussed the idea that in order to receive light, there must first be darkness, physical, emotional, and spiritual. In the holy text, it says of Jesus, out of darkness came the light. And in another place, it says, Jesus was the light of the world. In this series, I'd like to chat about just a few ways that Jesus is the light of the world. And we will do that for the next 2 weeks as well. How did his behaviors and his teachings impact the world forever? Today, I would like to begin with the most difficult virtue of humility. His story obviously begins with his humble birth, continues with a most humble lifestyle, and ends with not a humble but humiliating death alongside criminals. The life of Jesus reflects profound humility. He preaches it, he teaches it, he lives it. And it's the same thing we find in many great teachers and philosophers throughout history have lived very humble lives, and not in wealth and not really well appreciated. So let's begin by welcoming my dear friend, Father Robert Edwards, to the show. Father Rob, what's up on this beautiful rainy day in Southern California?
Hey, Charlie. No place I'd rather be than right here.
Well,
It's dry.
We are truth telling now, so let's be careful when you make a statement like that. So here we are for our listeners on the day before Thanksgiving 2019. It's raining and will continue to do so throughout the weekend, and I find this ironic because one of the things California needs more than anything else is rain. So God gives us rain, and it's on a perfect day. It's on Thanksgiving, during which we are to offer our thanks to God for good gifts, yet here we are whining and complaining that it's raining before a holiday. But isn't that what actually Thanksgiving, isn't Thanksgiving actually the perfect holiday for rain when we need it so badly?
I think that it's a great segue into humility. Exactly that.
Oh, I'm glad you said that, because my next thing was to say I'm not quite sure what this has to do with Advent and the subject of humility, but it is, isn't it?
Well, maybe we just don't know what we really want or what we really need.
I think that's every time, for the listeners, every time I'm silent, it's not because I don't have anything to say. It's because Robert has said something that makes me think, and he does that quite often. So, Father Rob, let's begin our time today with the humble birth motif that Scripture portrays of Jesus. Last week we talked about the light coming into darkness. In his birth, Jesus was the light coming both into the darkness of the night, the physical darkness, and the spiritual darkness of the world. I want to do something really unusual for me, and I want to give to our listeners a highlight of the gospel narrative of this story of the light coming into the world, and it's taken from the Gospel of Luke. So I'm going to be reading from the Bible. And for those of you who like to know exactly where, it's the second chapter, verse 8 and following, and I will probably skip a couple of sentences. And it begins by saying this: in the same region there were some shepherds staying out in the field and keeping watch over their flocks by night. And an angel of the Lord suddenly stood before them, and the glory of the Lord — now let's pay attention to the word glory — and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terribly frightened. This is not oh, cool, isn't that the glory of the Lord? This is, holy cow, this is the Lord. And an angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring to you good news, and it's good news of great joy that shall be for all people. For today in the city of David there has been born for you a Savior who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign for you that he is wrapped, that you will find a baby wrapped in clothes, in cloths, and lying in a manger." And now the important part here, not as if the other wasn't important, but the part I want to emphasize. "And suddenly there appeared with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host," so that would be thousands, right? Would not a multitude
Thousands.
of thousands of angels praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among men and women with whom he is well pleased." And I think what I like about that passage is that we as members of the Christian faith believe that Jesus is actually the Son of God, and I'm fascinated by the interplay between glory and humility. He was born in humility in a manger, and we talked about there was no room for him to stay anywhere else. He was born in the poorest part of town. And then you have these thousands of angels proclaiming to shepherds that are sleeping as they're watching their flock. And so God comes not only in darkness, but in sleeping people, and magnificent glory appears. So what do you make of that narrative, Robert, that describes both glory and humility?
Well, I think part of the thing with Jesus is that he is the, you know, as sometimes in Scripture referred to as the new Adam, and that the humility and glory, while they might seem to be two different things, are really closely tied to each other. In other words, that Jesus is an affirmation that all of humanity is special in God's eyes, and has been, and the incarnation happens within each one of us. That all of us has the divine image instilled within us, and so the way we get to that glory or that divine image is through humility. So the point is, they're both just tied together. You know, through our humility, we can access the divine light that is within us.
So is in some ways it's like last week in that the light comes out of darkness, and that there's always these polar opposites that are at work in God's economy.
Exactly. You can't have light without darkness. You can't experience God's glory without humility. And
in this for us in the second week of Advent, you know, as we're wondering, we continue to wonder, many people continue to wonder, what exactly is Advent about? And it's about the coming of the Christ, and we are focusing on how that coming impacted the world, not necessarily what the liturgical things we will be doing in the church. How do you think that his coming in glory and humility sheds light on the ways in which we can live spiritually and emotionally healthy lives? I'm thinking of something like, and these are my words, of rich in spirit and humble or poor in heart, that we have both of those going on in a perfect world.
Yeah, and I think that, for me, the main character in Advent, or the first one who appears on the scene, is John the Baptist, and he has that great line, it's one for all time, and that is, he says, I must decrease so that he might increase. And it seems to me that at some point in the beginning is, we call something close to that, checking our ego at the door. But in any point in time where we decrease, we can have access, or we gain access to insights or thoughts that are not generated by our own mind or ego mind. And so I think that, in that regard, everyday living, to really gain what we're looking for, or to find what we're looking for, means for us to get out of the way of ourselves.
Is that what you think decrease is really talking about, is getting out of the way of ourselves?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a spiritual thing that John's talking about. He's decreasing in order that the more we decrease, the more that the divine stamp within us increases. And so it's really about us getting out of the way of ourselves.
Is that acknowledging sort of a neediness of soul, a neediness of spirit, as we're getting out of the way, as we're decreasing?
Yeah, I think that at some point it's it really is. It's an unmasking. In other words, we don't have to do anything. We came into the world with this gift, and it's a matter of us not paving over it, if you will, and staying close to the source. And so certainly humility is would be one way of describing that process by which we get out of the way. And so Jesus over and over again talks about that. If in order to live, we need to die. The two of those are just not polar opposites. They are connected, and we will gain new life and die. And resurrection is about the same thing. So this idea of picking up humility and glory is lines up with everything else we know about in terms of spirituality.
Yeah, and I like maybe not like, but I'm fascinated by the word glory, and you would think the opposite of humility, and which we will talk about, is pride, but glory is, there's nothing more. There's nothing more to life than glory if we have a glorious life.
Absolutely.
And in one with the source that is profound. Now, you mentioned John the Baptist. It's funny that I have my next question is about John the Baptist, and this is one of my personal favorites in the Bible text. And Jesus lived an unusually abnormal and expected and unexpected life for those who were expecting him. He did not play by the rules. Even his predecessor, if I may use the word predecessor, it's not predecessor to the Christ, but it's predecessor to the words of Jesus, John the Baptist. Even John didn't understand Jesus' humble approach, humble manner. In fact, John the Baptist sent a group of his followers to ask Jesus, "Are you the expected one, or are we to look for another one to come to fulfill the Scriptures, to save the world?" And I love Jesus' response. And by the way, folks, this is my interpretation, but I can say honestly, it came from the Greek, and I translated it my way. But Jesus said, "Yes, I am the expected one. I just didn't come in the expected way." What do you think?
No, it was a great response, and there was a lot there. I mean, John was an ascetic, and so John was living out in the he was a priest kid who had broken away from the temple and all the rest, and went out into the wilderness, was all by himself, but lived a very disciplined life. And Jesus is living a very undisciplined life. He's wandering around and hanging out with sinners and tax collectors. He's partying, stays out late. He's called a wine bibber and the like. So I think there's two different ways of approaching God. And again, if you go back to glory, Jesus, knew what glory was. And he said that, he said in numerous, more than one occasion, "I never did anything outside the will of my Father." And I think that shocked John, because John thought that the way to God was by rote practice and not by tapping into, if you will, to his own innate glory.
Yeah, by the way, the religious standards of the day. That passage, by the way, comes from, I believe it's Matthew chapter 11. and it ends by Jesus saying, "Blessed are those who do not stumble over me." Now that doesn't make that much sense to me. Who didn't, not stumbling. He's telling John, "Blessed are those who do not stumble over my meek and humble ways, that I have a hold, that I'm hanging out with the people that nobody wants me to hang out with." But you know the Greek verb for that stumble? You know what the Greek verb is? It's scandalizomai.
No, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
It's scandalizomai.
Yes.
So he's really saying,
Good point.
and they refuse to translate it as such, but blessed are those that are not scandalized by me, because his behavior was indeed scandalous.
Yeah. And you can make the case that he saw the glory in all people. So every time Jesus sees somebody, he doesn't see what others refer to as the sin of the person. He sees a person who's made in God's image, one of God's children. So consequently, the glory part is running all the way through everything that he does, including how he sees the world.
That's fascinating that Jesus sees the glory in people, because he sees the genuine godlike humanity.
Absolutely.
And
not the that's which had been built up around them, but if you will, the shell, or the
which
mask.
they've built around themselves.
Exactly.
Yes. Now, Jesus seemed to view humility as an enviable virtue, and we like to take humility and give lip service to it, that we want to be humble, but really very few of us, if any, really want to be humble.
No.
It's or to be, especially to be humbled. But as I said, he views humility as an enviable virtue, and not a painful one. He even goes so far as to say, when Jesus himself summarized why people should follow him, he said it was because he was meek and humble. Now, those are not the attributes of leaders. Meek and, although I have read in leadership journals about one of the strongest qualities of a leader today is humility. But if a leader were to say he were meek and humble, we're looking for strong visionaries,
Sure.
strong people with a plan to overcome or overtake something.
Sure.
And I've got to say, I'm thinking when he says, "You should follow me because I'm meek and humble," and I'm saying, are you kidding? Meek and humble? This is certainly not found in the How to Make People Follow You code book.
Absolutely not. And it didn't work when especially when you think about, if he's going to be the Messiah, he was going to come from the son. He was going to be David's son, and David was the consummate warrior, poet, all around.
He was everything.
Yeah, he was. So you can see how that this is a contrarian viewpoint for sure.
Very much, very much. I'm glad you brought up David, one of my favorite characters in Scripture. But you know what this flies in the face of, Robert, is if we're talking about this kind of humility and this kind of not, I don't like to view it as a lowly view of yourself, but an even view of yourself, a realistic view of yourself, of understanding who you are. But how does that compare to today's prosperity gospel that is so popular, where it's preached that riches and freedom from pain and who knows what all, that just does not, cannot be reconciled with these words of Jesus.
Yeah, and there's nothing in the Scripture for that at all about prosperity. I have that one story that we've talked about before that I've used on several occasions. But for me, the whole story of the Buddhist farmer who basically one day a horse shows up and so he says, "You're blessed. You have a new horse." And he says, "Maybe I'm blessed. Maybe I'm cursed." And the next day, the horse is riding around and takes off and And he says, you've lost your horse. Maybe I'm blessed. Maybe I'm cursed. And this story goes back and forth. And eventually, at some point in time, the son breaks his leg, and they say he's cursed, and the father's cursed, and then consequently the army shows up, and then then the son isn't taken away. Whole point is, how do we know what's good for us and what's not good for us? I mean, the whole point of humility is at some point is opening ourselves up to the idea that I don't know from 1 minute to the next what would be good for me, and it certainly can make a great case that winning the lottery would not be a good thing.
That's a really intriguing view of humility in let me kind of think back to what you said just before the winning the lottery, that you were talking about humility being the willingness to accept good things, or the ability to accept the glory and the
or just accept that I don't know. As soon as I know what I need, then I've lost. That's not a position of humility, and I also I'm further away from reality. I remember one time I heard I think it was Dwayne Dwyer of all people, but he said a great line. He said, "We oftentimes don't have enough information to be pessimistic." In other words, we don't know from 1 minute to the next what's going to happen, and consequently, humility is that stance that I don't know what's best or what's worse, and so therefore I have a more open mind to see what's real.
You know what I have found personally, and I'm certainly not claiming to be a humble person, I have found that I talk frequently about Richard Rohr's second half of life.
Mm-hmm.
And I have talked frequently about in the second half of life, we are much more open to other positions, other
mm-hmm.
mm-hmm. other
mm-hmm.
beliefs, other thoughts. And that, I have said that I know, I may know more than I used to know, I mean, facts and data, but I know less for sure. I was much more sure about things
Absolutely.
At 35 than
Absolutely.
I am at 70.
Yep.
And that seems to correlate with what you're saying.
It does. And and Rohr's got that great book, and there's a new one out. David Brooks has got a book called The Second Mountain, which is much the same thing. But the whole point is, when we're younger, we're trying to fill things up and all about ourselves. And we get a bit older, we turn that corner and start staring down the end of life. And at that point, we're trying to lose things, and we're not trying to go ahead and build up anything. We're trying to let go of things so that we can find out who we really are.
That's and it gets very practical. This, we're not just talking about spiritual attributes, but actually physical attributes. And you and I were talking a bit earlier about the stuff we have collected, and how much of a burden that really is. That we need to be able to let go of that stuff. And there's probably 2/3 of the stuff in my house that I could get rid of and would never miss.
Absolutely. I think I told you I got a couple of boxes that have been, survived 3 moves now, and they're still taped up. I don't, they're surprise boxes at this point. Yeah, and Albert Einstein, one of my favorite quotes that he had was that never own anything you can't leave out in the rain. At some point, the more things we own, the more things we have to take care of.
I love that. Never own anything you can't take out in the rain.
Especially in a day like today.
Yeah, that's good. And that would mean I have to get rid of seminary notes from 1982. What the heck am I doing with seminary notes from 1982? Like I'm ever going to go back
honestly
and read those?
No, I lost all my books a long time ago. I just mostly go online at this point, but that's just between me and you. Oh wait, we're online. We're on the air.
We're on the air. Yeah. I when we did our last move, I think I gave 1,000 books away, and I still now have collected them where they're just in stacks and piles and the funny thing is, I wish I could say I've read them all.
Honestly.
Yeah. Now, I'm talking about books. I'm currently reading this really good book by Ryan Holiday, and it's the third book in what he's calling a trilogy. The title of the book is Stillness is the Key, and his first 2 books have amazing titles that I haven't read the books, but by the titles, I want to read the books. And it is, they are, The Ego is the Enemy, The Obstacle is the Way, and this one, Stillness is the Key. He's a very fine very fine writer. And I use Stillness as the Key as my morning reflections, where I'll read a chapter a day, and after I meditate, and then I'll do journals on that. And today, the chapter today was on enough. When do we have enough, and what is enough? And that we live in a culture that always wants more and always telling us that we don't have enough, and we want more possessions, and we want more rights, and we want more titles. In fact, my blog this week is going to be on that. And in the book, he quotes Lao Tzu, one of my favorites in the Tao Te Ching, and he writes this: when you realize there is nothing lacking, the whole world belongs to you. And it's not nothing lacking in things, it's that nothing is lacking in your desire for things.
No. Was it Thoreau who said, "I make my wants few and I become rich"? That at some point in time it's about exactly that. And I think it goes back to glory. At the end of the day, we have been given a divine gift, and when we've been which someplace within us, Jesus would call it the kingdom. But it's all about us, but also within, and that he says when we become a child, when we turn and not know anything, at that moment we know everything. We have access to a wisdom that is far beyond anything we can imagine.
And the humility, we must have the humility to be able to accept and proclaim that we do not know everything.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I want to, at this time, I want to sort of switch our topic a little. Not switch our topic, but talk about the opposite of humility, because we've sort of gone around on that, and what we haven't discussed is what I'm calling the human curse of pride. Pride not only believes that you never have enough, but that you deserve more. And we find this notion everywhere. How many TV commercials now are belting out the statement, "You deserve it"?
Mm-hmm. Remember, you can have it all.
What's that all about? It's just it's gratifying our ego, and it's supporting our desire to have and to take and say, if I deserve it, whatever. And it's almost like you deserve it at any cost, and if the cost is to other people.
Mm-hmm. It's that same line of thinking along as those with the most toys wins. At the end of the day, about accumulation. And if you think about it, all spirituality from every religion and every philosophy goes back to the same thing. It's always going to go back to John's original line of decreasing to increase. And again, Meister Eckhart says all spirituality is about subtraction, not addition. So,
talk to me about that. You used that last week, and I really, the line really resonates with me. But
well, it's a simple line, but it's the same thing. When we are able, the less our ego gets in the way, the more we find our original self. And our original self is a place full of wisdom, full of hope, full of joy, full of everything that we need in a given moment. We might not think we need it, but it has everything that we need. So when we're able to find that place where we can go internally instead of externally, it'll be we'll have access to something that's far beyond what we can imagine.
Sort of Ryan Holiday's Enough.
Yeah, exactly that. That we do have enough. That we, in other words, and you can go over and over again about looking throughout the world in times where people who have garnered a lot of things are not happy. There's not a price tag on something like that. You just can't find it. We can't go out and purchase it in the store. And it does. Everyone will tell you the same thing. It is about decreasing in order to increase.
I've read stories as have you of lottery winners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And after they win their $1 million or $500 million or whatever, and they spend it, and they are no better off than when they began.
Mm-hmm.
That's really hard for us in the United States to conceive of. It's not. It's almost anti-American.
Yeah. And it's so funny in the scriptures. It's always the blind people are oftentimes the one who can see. There's a lot about blindness in the scriptures in terms of blind people recognize Jesus because they're not corrupted, if you will, by their eyesight or their outward looking ability. That they are able to sense God and not necessarily see. There's one point in time where the Pharisees actually say to Jesus, "Are you telling us we're blind?" And he says, "You're blind because you say you can see."
That's again a very profound thought. That we are blinded by our sights and our desires.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
The Bible tells us, as well as scores of other texts, that there is no approach to God or genuine spirituality when obsessed with pride. It is written in the Bible text that God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. How do you describe that depravity of pride?
I'm thinking.
I'm pondering.
Rephrase that for me. Help me out here. I'm a little lost.
Okay, I just jumped around here a bit, and I now have to find. I have to find the quote that I was just talking from. Is that the Bible, as well as a number of other texts, talk about our approach to God and genuine spirituality when obsessed with pride, and it's written that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. What is he opposed to in the proud?
I would, at some point, I would say that would probably be the rejection of our true self. In other words, that, what's that one thing I've seen my grandmother used to have on her refrigerator, says God didn't make junk. That we've been made, and we are made perfect in God's eyes. And so it seems to me when we pursue things outside of ourselves, we are rejecting God's handiwork, it's at some level, and that there is a sense of we're going to have to return to that. We really want to find our true self. It's going to be about not going outward, but coming back inward.
That's and it reminds me of the title of a book, and a book that was written by a Old Testament professor in seminary of mine, Ron Allen, and it was titled "The Majesty of Man." And that seems, and just talking about created in the image of God, and that there is a certain majesty to man.
Yeah, but the incarnation, where we're going with Advent, is the highlight of that, right? Is the ultimate moment for that. God still sees humanity to be so amazing that he would choose to come down and be born a woman. It's an emphatic statement about all of us.
Absolutely, and to be born of a very spiritual woman, but a woman of sort of ultimate humble means. She was not a queen or a princess, and not royalty that you would think God would come as. He comes exactly the opposite. He comes in a humble and often humiliating way.
And she had the great response, right? Let it be.
Let it be.
It's not about there's no agenda there.
Yeah, I think of that every time I hear Paul McCartney's song. I want to do this on pride. I want to approach what is often considered the slippery slope of the difference between being proud of one's accomplishments and that awful anti-virtue of pride. Do you think your Weltanschauung worldview, do you think it's possible to be proud of oneself without being prideful?
Yes. I mean, within limits, I guess. I mean, it's nothing wrong with being proud, but I think that, at some level, when I'm dwelling on my accomplishments, I'm missing out on moments that are passing by. And so I think at some point, how much time I'm spending being proud, when any moment I'm spending being proud, I'm doing something and missing out on something else. So I think at some point, and then if being proud then spills into a state of pride, then of course I'm really in trouble. But point being that from moment to moment, there's always something happening, always something going on, and if I'm dwelling on accomplishments, I'm missing out.
Like I ask you, what of the student that gets straight A's through school? Now to me, that's something to be proud of.
Sure,
that student has worked hard.
Absolutely.
It wasn't given to her. Mm-hmm. She did her studies. She did all of her work. That is something to be prideful about. Where is the line where that's dangerous?
Yeah, I don't know if it's ever dangerous, but I think at some point, again, if that defines her, then she's any one of us, when we allow our accomplishments to define us, then we've lost our way again, because they really don't. At the end of the day, we've talked about that. And for instance, if you've had a child, I love my child no matter what. No matter where they wind up, they're always going to be loved. And I'm proud of them in numerous ways, but oftentimes not in the ways of what they've accomplished, is in terms of who they've become and things that they've grown through and the like. But it's really more of it's not based on the world measurement of pride, if you will.
Yeah, I've tried that with my son and tried really hard not to have him get any impression whatsoever that I am proud of him because of his achievements mm-hmm. in athletics. Mm-hmm. That I out and out say that is not why I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you for the man you are becoming, mm-hmm. the good person you are becoming, mm-hmm. the character you are trying to develop, and I hope to be proud of him as a husband to a new wife.
Sure.
But that's completely different than the accomplishments of, gosh, I hate using this term, but of the world, and I'll just replace it with the United States, mm-hmm. with the American dream, the accomplishments of all of those sort of things.
And all those things ultimately will be taken away from us in the end anyway. They're not really anything about who we are. You reminded me 20 years ago that as important as we think we are, we're going to walk down any cemetery and see all kinds of other people who thought they were important too, and guess what? We all go back to the same place. So any sense of accomplishments, they belong with everything else. We're not taking them with us.
Yeah, like when I left the church, there was a minister there, a friend. When I left ministry, not left the church, but left ministry, a friend of mine says, get a bucket of water, put your fist in that bucket of water and pull your fist out, and as quickly as it takes to fill that hole is as long as people will remember you.
That's good. Yeah, exactly. And that's what accomplishments are at the end of the day. They're not really who we are. And consequently, spending a lot of time celebrating them, again, I think at some point you can make the case that we're missing the boat.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As I was preparing for the show, before you came to the club, I spoke with Matthew, the new manager there, and we were talking about humility, and he offered to me, I think, a really interesting insight that I would like your feedback on. And he said he was told, I believe by his father, or that he had read, that there are two paths to humility. There's the path of service and the path of suffering. And those really resonated with me, because service requires humility. And, well, I guess you can be a prideful server thinking, I'm doing better than anybody else. But most servants are humble people, are doing it out of love and care for other people. And then there's that Alcoholics Anonymous path of suffering where you don't come out of it till you hit bottom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and both of them are around the ego, right? To serve other people is to reject our own ego and to put it second. And when we go through suffering, at some point, Rohr talks about that with mystics. People get insights into that other realm if they've either meditated forever and ever. They're born just with some kind of innate ability to meditate, or they've been through a crisis, and it's a crisis that causes the ego to say, I don't know what to do. And once that happens, then the world's wide open.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that more. That reminds me of Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, and we'll talk about that more next week as we talk on hope, what Viktor Frankl had to say on that, and I think that's so important. I would, as we're beginning to wrap up, there is something that I wanted to bring up earlier, and I just think that it is such a fantastic example of humility that it's really helpful for me to bring it up here. And Jesus says in the Beatitudes that the meek or humble will inherit the earth, and that you put up with the bullshit here, but at the end of the day, because you did that with grace and with peace and with love and with kindness, you will be the inheritors. You will be the highly looked upon in the later times. And I think, for me, one of the best examples of that is depicted in Steven Spielberg's film The Color Purple, where Celie, portrayed by Oscar-winning Oprah Winfrey, is treated brutally and abused her entire life by her husband as well as many others. But she humbly accepted the abuse and meekness, with meekness and kindness. She just responded totally opposite the way any one of us would respond. And at the end of the film, Celie is her name, is sitting. Spielberg has her sitting on a porch, surrounded by family and friends, and she is the most honored woman present. And I think that it was one of the best examples of the meek and humble inheriting the earth. Do you remember that film?
I'm trying to remember that scene. I'm struggling.
It was the closing scene.
Darn it.
She was sitting there on the porch,
That's
and
good.
she's just surrounded by dozens of people are surrounding her, and they're all paying attention to her like she is the sage. She is the one who has inherited the earth.
She's intact. Very good. Yeah, and I think the Beatitudes, they start off with beginning with blessed. We are already blessed. Or you could even insert glory there if you want to, right? We already have glory, and therefore when we are meek and humble, we have access to it. But it's in other words, I once heard someone say it's the Beatitudes, not the do-attitudes. And in the do-attitudes, we'd have to find something. And the Beatitudes is about having an attitude of being that allows us to again go way beyond ourselves.
I like that a lot. Finally, to wrap up our show, I want to do it with the oft-quoted statement of humility, and that is, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less.
That's right. That's a Rick Warren statement, I think.
That's what I heard. I heard him quoted, but I thought I heard it before that, so I wasn't really sure.
No, that's it. It's a sharp quote. I like it.
That's exactly what I think of it. I think it's a short quote, and I like it.
Yeah.
But I think packed around humility is so much more. And I've written, although there's much truth to that statement, I've always viewed. I view humility a different way. I view humility as the great leveler or equalizer of people on the earth. It's when the haves understand themselves not as better than anyone else, and the have-nots understand that on a spiritual level they are not less than but equal to. So it's the decreasing of the haves, of the prideful, and it's the increasing of the meek, to where we're all at a level, we're all at the level that God or our spiritual nature demands of us. And I think that if that were to occur, we would have a world of peace and equality and prosperity.
There's nothing in the Scripture that would refute that. That's for sure. I mean, certainly the Creator says everything we need has already been placed, not only within us but about us. So it's just a matter of us figuring that part out.
Yeah, and also in that same passage, I have to add that it probably has nothing to do with humility, but that we are also granted access to the divine state, that we become actually a fourth member of the Trinity, that we can become divine members.
Absolutely.
Which is
I go back to the incarnation for sure for that, though. If God didn't think that humanity was the most incredible thing He'd done, why would He come back and inhabit us? Why not just become a being from another realm? But the whole point there was that this is good. It was good in the beginning, and it's good now.
That is wonderful. I have many comments, but I'm not going to say any because I think that's a great way to wrap it up. Why would God come if He did not have the ultimate respect and confidence in who we are?
Or dare we say pride?
Father Rob, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I look forward to our next show with you, which I believe is going to be on hope. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in to The Next Chapter with Charlie. Be sure to check us out at our website, thenextchapter.life. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.
Yeah.